Fighter pilot Alex Ratiu fought alongside Filipino guerrillas both on the ground and in the air, targeting Japanese planes. On June 23, 1944, Lieutenant Alex Ratiu posed for a photograph with Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, the commander of Task Force 58, aboard the aircraft carrier Lexington. They stood on the starboard wing of Alex's Hellcat. Mitcher wore his typical khakis and distinctive lobsterman's hat, while Alex was in his flight gear. Just below the canopy of the Hellcat were 19 Rising Sun decals, marking Alex's aerial victories. With just one more kill, he would become a quadruple ace. At 25 years old, he was the leading fighter ace in the U.S. Navy. Just days earlier, on June 19th, Alex had flown his Grumman F-6F Hellcat as part of Lexington's Fighting Squadron 16. In just 8 minutes, using only 360 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, he shot down 6 Japanese aircraft. When he returned to the carrier, he smiled broadly and held up 6 gloved fingers for a photo that became a symbol of the legendary Mariana's turkey shoot during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In this lopsided battle, U.S. Navy pilots and ship gunners destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft, while losing about 30 of their own. Although Alex had the highest number of Navy kills at the time, other pilots were quickly gaining ground. One determined rival was 34-year-old Commander David McCampbell, the commander of VF-15, based on the carrier Essex. McCampbell began June 19th with just 2 confirmed kills, but ended the day with 9, closing in on Alex's total. Not long after the photo with Mitcher, Alex and the other pilots of Fighting 16 were sent to Pearl Harbor aboard the carrier Enterprise, and then transferred to the escort carrier Mackinac Island for a 30-day leave in San Diego. The Navy came up with several promotional ideas for its top ace. Alex, who had just been promoted to full lieutenant, was offered the opportunity to fly a captured Japanese Mitsubishi Zero across the country. Another idea was to pair him with Lieutenant Cook Cleland, a dive bomber pilot, for a war bond tour. Although the ideas were interesting, Alex was eager to return to combat. He later said that he didn't want to spend time talking to people who had avoided the draft. During his leave, Alex returned to his hometown of East Chicago, Indiana, where he was honored with a parade and a stadium reception. More importantly, he reconnected with Catherine Horn, a childhood friend who had grown into a beautiful young woman. Despite their whirlwind romance and a honeymoon in New York, Alex was determined to return to the Pacific. After a temporary posting to Jacksonville, Florida, a helpful admiral intervened to get Alex back into combat. There was a high demand for fighter pilots as the kamikaze threat was rising and the Japanese fleet was severely weakened. The Navy was shifting resources from bombers and torpedo planes to fighter squadrons. Adding to Alex's motivation was the fact that McCampbell had overtaken him as the Navy's top ace. On October 21st, McCampbell scored his 20th aerial victory, and just 3 days later, he shot down 9 more enemy aircraft in a single day. Alex initially received orders to join VF-9, the squadron that had replaced VF-16. But when he arrived at the forward base at Ulithi, he learned that the Lexington had been hit by a kamikaze on November 5th and was being sent back home. Determined to stay in action, Alex benefited from another intervention, this time by Lexington's commanding officer, Ernest Litch, who arranged a transfer to VF-20 aboard the Enterprise. Alex returned to action on December 14, 1944, flying 2 combat sweeps around Clark Field during the campaign to weaken Japanese defenses before the invasion of Mindoro. His early morning mission focused on strafing ground targets. He destroyed a parked Nakajima Ki 44 Tojo at Angeles Field, though ground kills didn't count toward his aerial total. In a second mission later that morning, he destroyed more enemy aircraft on the ground, including a Mitsubishi G4M Betty and 2 more Tojos. But during his last strafing run, disaster struck. His Hellcat was hit and oil began pouring into the cockpit. As oil pressure dropped, Alex knew he couldn't keep the plane flying much longer. He climbed to 900 feet and turned west toward Mount Pinatubo, following intelligence advice to avoid the lowlands. After opening the canopy and tossing out unnecessary items, Alex climbed out onto the wing of his aircraft. He hesitated for a moment, then let go and tumbled into the air, trying to avoid being hit by his plane's tail. He hit the ground hard and hadn't been able to control his landing. Dazed but determined not to be captured, he pulled out his .45 caliber pistol. He saw men running toward him and, assuming they were Japanese, prepared to defend himself, but they raised their hands and shouted that they were Filipino. Fortunately, Alex didn't fire. They helped him out of his oil-soaked suit and helmet, gave him a straw hat and tight-fitting clothes. Their leader, a young guerrilla named Luis Ramos, quickly moved him out of the area. The Japanese were nearby. Armed with his pistol, a knife, a canteen, some atabrine tablets, and a bundle of emergency cash, Alex began his life as a guerrilla fighter in the Philippines. He kept a detailed diary of his experiences, which he later shared. When the Japanese took the Philippines early in the war, they tried to win over the local population to their so-called Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. When persuasion failed, they resorted to arrests, harsh reprisals, and executions to suppress resistance. But with the archipelago's 7,000 islands spread over 1,000 miles, they couldn't control everything. With the Philippine constabulary disbanded, bandits roamed the countryside, looting and terrorizing villagers. In response, local defense groups formed and eventually merged with escaped American and Filipino soldiers to build the foundation of a strong resistance movement. It wasn't until early 1943 that General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area Command could begin aiding and coordinating these guerrilla forces. Their operations identified 4 main types of resistance units: those formed around regular U.S. and Philippine troops, those made by locals to fight banditry, those tied to political organizations, and a few remaining outlaw bands. For much of the war, Luzon, with its heavy Japanese presence and strong surveillance, remained a challenging area for resistance operations. It wasn't until mid-1944 that agents from the Southwest Pacific area were finally able to contact American guerrilla commanders in southern and central Luzon. It wasn't until September that submarines were able to deliver radio equipment and supplies. Alex Ratiu had parachuted into a chaotic and contested area outside the command of the 2 main Luzon guerrilla forces, led by U.S. Army Major Bernard L. Anderson in the east and Major Robert Laughlin in the central region. According to reports, Alex landed on the Ramos family farm, part of the South Tarlac Military District, not far from the Japanese-controlled town of Capas in Tarlac Province. His goal was to link up with Captain Alfred Bruce, a former U.S. Army military police officer turned guerrilla leader and South Tarlac commander. Rescuers led Alex on an 18-kilometer trek but had to backtrack 6 kilometers after learning Bruce had retreated deeper into the hills to avoid a Japanese raid. That day, they were joined by Filipino guerrilla Major Alberto K. Stockton, who told Alex that he had buried the remains of Alex's VF-20 squadron mate, Lieutenant J.D.N. Baker, who had also been shot down by flak. By noon on September 16th, the group reached Captain Bruce's new camp, where Alex met another downed naval aviator, Lieutenant F. Grassy Graspa, a TBF Avenger pilot from the USS Hornet's Torpedo 11 squadron. He had been shot down on November 6th. They were now in Negrito territory, a region inhabited by small, dark-skinned Aboriginal tribes Alex would come to know as the Itas, or Belugas. Bruce's camp offered some comfort, a place to bathe, eat chicken, duck, wild pork, rice, corn, and bananas, and even use books and paper scraps to keep a diary. Alex handed over the money he had parachuted in with to Bruce. Along with the guerrillas and their Beluga allies, they stayed hidden, waiting for the expected American invasion of Luzon. Documents show that Bruce's South Tarlac district reported to an Army lieutenant colonel named Wright, through Wright's executive officer, another lieutenant colonel named P.D. Sears. While Bruce's band was organized, they were poorly armed and nearly out of ammunition, which left them mostly in hiding, avoiding Japanese patrols. News arrived that Mindoro had been invaded, and Bruce believed a landing at Lingayen Gulf was imminent. Alex learned that Bruce, known for his long beard and fondness for gin, had narrowly escaped Japanese forces multiple times. Once he had watched a fellow American officer, Lieutenant John Hart, shoot himself to avoid capture. Alex also found out there was a large bounty on his head. Villagers in Capas were reportedly killed by the Japanese as they searched for him. Unless the Japanese got too close, Bruce planned to wait for the American landing. Apart from a bombing run on December 22nd by 24 B-24 Liberators, there was little sign of an imminent offensive. Despite rainy weather and dwindling supplies, Alex stayed in good health and received gifts of new clothes, though they were tight and too short. One of the few highlights was watching a 45-minute dogfight between American P-38 Lightnings and Japanese fighter planes, during which 6 aircraft, 1 American and 5 Japanese, crashed. Alex's diary recorded his mixed feelings of anticipation, envy, and frustration. On December 26th, he wrote that clouds had ruined the view and expressed his anger toward the Japanese forces and their anti-aircraft gunners. In the following days, Alex fired 4 hopeful shots at Japanese twin-engine Sally bombers flying overhead, noting that he badly needed a gun sight and proper firepower. After that, he chose to save his remaining bullets. By January 4th, 1945, he watched in exasperation as a group of P-38s flew right over 9 enemy planes without engaging. Air action intensified on January 6th and continued despite poor weather. On the morning of January 7th, Alex saw over 100 A-26 Invader bombers streak across the valley, apparently headed for Clark Field. Later that day, 24 Hellcats bombed and strafed enemy airfields. The sound of bombs and machine guns was soon joined by the rumble of distant artillery, which Alex assumed was American naval bombardment. On January 8th, Bruce reported that the invasion would begin the following night. Alex and Graspa were soon joined by another downed pilot, Ensign Alan Stover, a member of a night fighting squadron from the USS Independence. When naval shelling began at midnight and continued into the morning of January 9th, Bruce decided it was time to send a guerrilla team to make direct contact with American forces. The mission had 2 goals: to share maps and intelligence, and to secure desperately needed weapons and ammunition. Alex, being the only American healthy enough to travel, would go as Bruce's representative. He was energized, unaware of the dangers ahead. The group moved north along the western side of the valley, avoiding roads and picking up more men as they went. They spent the first night at one of Major Stockton's camps, growing to 75 in number. The next day they passed near Camp O'Donnell, the infamous end point of the Bataan Death March. At a guerrilla-run camp in Tarlac, Alex met 4 other rescued airmen, including Ensign James W. Robinson, a VF-20 squadron mate who had been shot down on December 14th. The 4 chose not to join the journey. Now numbering nearly 100, Alex's group left on January 12th for the large town of Moncada, which was under the control of guerrilla leader Albert S. Hendrickson, a U.S. Army private who had been promoted in the field. Alex quickly learned that guerrilla factions like Hendrickson's fiercely protected their territory and held on to long-standing rivalries. Tensions boiled over in Moncada on January 13th. While Alex's team waited in the town plaza, he met with the mayor, the police chief, a guerrilla major named Dessin, and the American wife of a local villager. Just as they were heading to lunch, a hostile guerrilla confronted them. He wore a Japanese pilot's helmet and had his rifle half raised. The man shouted, "Hook!" a reference to Hukbalahap, the communist-aligned anti-Japanese resistance made up of central Luzon farmers. Originally a political movement, they had joined the broader anti-Japanese resistance. After the war, they would go on to lead a bloody rebellion against the Philippine government. Even at this stage, the Hukbalahap movement, which held sway over an area between Tarlac and Manila, had a reputation for fanaticism and terror that went beyond the struggle with the Japanese. For some, the Huks represented a righteous people's movement. For others, they were a provocation. When Alex encountered an armed man, his instincts kicked in and he reached for his service pistol, but he could see the man was just as puzzled as he was. "No, I'm an American. What's going on here?" he asked. Receiving no response, but sensing hesitation, Alex said, "Okay, take me to your leader." As they followed the man toward the plaza, one of the guerrillas in Alex's group suddenly ran toward him, only to be gunned down by a burst of carbine fire that almost split him in half. He died within seconds. Under fire and in a mix of shock and fury, Alex ran forward, shouting, "Stop firing! Stop firing!" according to reports later written by Alicio Mahler and Alberto Stockton. His quick response likely prevented a massacre. Still, when the firing stopped, one of Bruce's USAFFE troops was dead, another wounded, and about a quarter of Alex's group had fled in panic. The attackers turned out to be a unit from Hendrickson's North Tarlac district, led by a Filipino officer named Cleto. A heated exchange followed, more shouting than diplomacy. Cleto called Bruce a thief and a lazy man hiding in the mountains. He claimed Hendrickson, not Bruce, had full control over all of Tarlac. Cleto's better-armed force prevailed. All of Bruce's men, except Alex and Stockton, were disarmed and confined in several houses. They were later released and allowed to return to Bruce's camp. Alex's quest for freedom took an unusual turn. He found himself atop a small horse that kept trying to bite his leg. Cleto's men departed just after midnight on January 15th. They marched all night through countryside, still crawling with Japanese forces, to reach Hendrickson's headquarters near the town of Jonah. When they arrived the next morning, Alex got his first look at the South Tarlac commander, and it wasn't a good one. Hendrickson was a drunkard, loud, aggressive, and clearly intoxicated. He sent out armed men recklessly and ruled with a volatile hand. As the day went on, Alex's impression only worsened. Hendrickson and his unruly men were often passed out drunk by mid-afternoon. He lived off the land like a gangster, threatening locals who couldn't meet his demands for food and liquor, accusing them of being pro-Japanese. He showed little concern for the actual American forces, as if they were the ones who should report to him. On January 16th, word came that a large Japanese force was headed toward a nearby river crossing. Armed with a carbine and 75 rounds, Alex joined a tense overnight watch. The night passed without contact, but Alex couldn't shake the absurdity of the moment. Lying on his stomach in the mud, he thought, "What's a good fighter pilot doing in the middle of this godforsaken country?" The next morning, a runner finally brought word that American GIs were approaching Panique, a town north of Jonah. Hendrickson, wanting to make a grand impression, prepared a procession to meet them. On the afternoon of January 17th, they moved north. Hendrickson on horseback at the front, Alex and others riding along, with guerrillas marching behind. American, Philippine, and guerrilla flags waved, a bugler played loudly, and villagers came out to watch. Near Panique, the parade encountered its first American GI, a confused sentry from the 129th Division out of Illinois. Cleared to continue, the group eventually reached the advancing American lines, and Alex was finally back in friendly hands. A brigadier general personally debriefed him, and the process was repeated 3 more times in the following days. Eventually, Alex boarded the amphibious command ship Wasatch off Lingayen. There, he met a war correspondent who had previously been aboard the Lexington during the Marianas campaign. The reporter recognized Alex despite his scruffy beard and, in exchange for an exclusive story, promised to get word of his survival back to Catherine. Alex reached Ulithi and returned to the Lexington, bringing with him a Japanese officer's sword and pistol, along with first-hand stories of life behind enemy lines. He became a shipboard celebrity during the voyage back to Pearl Harbor, refusing to shave his now famous beard, which irritated the ship's executive officer. He was also determined to stay in the Pacific and somehow arranged for a transfer to another squadron in anticipation of the strikes on Japan. But it wasn't meant to be. Because of his extensive knowledge of local conditions and his time behind enemy lines, the Navy couldn't risk him being captured. Alex's combat days were over. At just 19, he was reassigned to the Naval Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland, for the remainder of the war. He ended the Pacific War as the U.S. Navy's fourth-ranking fighter ace. The Navy's top ace was David McCampbell, a Medal of Honor recipient with 34 confirmed aerial kills, many of them in the closing stages of the war. Although Alex received the Navy Cross, he was nominated for the Medal of Honor but never received it. Alex was the writer's first cousin and personal hero. The article was a fascinating read. One commenter, H. Triskin, added a note about Alan J. Smokey Stover, a pilot from VF-81 who was shot down on January 6, 1945, over Clark Field and returned to his squadron on February 8 at Ulithi. He wondered if Stover had traveled with Alex. Another person shared that they had lived in the neighboring province of Pampanga for 2 years, and noted that Tarlac, though calmer today, still had a reputation for its wild nature. Alex was lucky to make it out as well as he did.